Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the CGD event. My name is Helen Debster. I'm a policy fellow here at CGD, and today I have the pleasure to speak to Fatema Sumar. She has a very long and distinguished career throughout the US policy and development worlds, and has recently written a book about her experiences. This one here, The Development Diplomat, working across borders, boardrooms, and bureaucracies to end poverty. I would highly recommend that you head to your favorite bookseller after this event and pick yourself up a copy. I personally found it incredibly fascinating, detailed, very easy to read, and truly believe that there's something in it for everyone, from undergraduates just starting on their development and foreign policy careers to people established in the sector and wanting to know how we can do better. So we only have 1 hour with Fatema today to talk through her book and what she's learned throughout her career. So let me quickly talk you through how today's event will work. So firstly, I'm going to give Fatema a few minutes to talk through her book and what she hopes people take away from it. I then have a few questions for Fatema about some of the pieces she mentions in her book, before I will then open up to questions from the audience. If you have questions, there are a few ways in which you can submit them. So firstly, you can send us an email. It's events@cgdev.org. You can tweet us at CGDev, CGDEV, or tweet us with the hashtag CGDTalks, or you can submit your comments via YouTube. So as Fatema is speaking, please have a think about potential questions you may want to ask. But firstly, I'll hand off to Fatema. The floor is yours.
Well, Helen, thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of you joining from wherever you're joining from. I hope you're safe, I hope you're healthy, and I hope your families are doing well. Helen, I'm so grateful to you and the Center for Global Development for hosting this conversation and your interest in this book around what I'm calling development diplomacy, a space that I've had the privilege of working in for most of my career, crossing over from foreign policy to international development and seeing really the spaces in between and how we can better leverage those spaces to break poverty at scale. And so I'm excited to have this conversation today. Thanks so much for taking the time and the interest. And, you know, Helen, I would just step back and say for all our viewers out there, you know, whether you're just starting out your careers, whether you're back in school, or whether you're a current practitioner, I think many of us, when we started on this journey to see how we could contribute to end poverty and to hit our collective commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals to end poverty by 2030. We all share the same passions. Most of us share the same values, the same commitment and energy and drive. I know we work hard, whether we're just starting out or whether we're many years into our careers, and yet we often get stuck and siloed. And we often end up spinning our wheels sometimes to figure out why the work we're doing is not sustainable, or why the work we're doing is not enough to get the attention of key policymakers and make the kinds of changes at scale we want to see. And so during the height of the pandemic, while we were all homeschooling, taking long walks through the woods and everything in between, I decided to take some time to reflect and write about the career experiences I've had across the US government, both the executive and legislative branches, and really share behind the scenes stories of what these jobs look like, what it takes, what success, but more importantly, what failure actually looks like from behind the scenes, and the spaces in between foreign policy, national security, international development that really intersect all our worlds, but often we only approach it from a very particular lens. And so those are some of the stories I wanted to put on paper and share, and especially share for people who may not look like the status quo in Washington and in other foreign capitals. People who are trying to break into power centers and places and bring a different voice to the table. I wanted to bring a different perspective to the table as a first-generation immigrant, South Asian woman, and as a mom, and someone who's been doing this juggling young children along the way. So excited to talk about the book, The Development Diplomat, and take it from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, Fatema. And so I hope it's okay now if you'll indulge me to ask a few questions. I have many, many more than this, so I'll try and keep it limited. So my first question is probably unsurprisingly about Afghanistan. So a large chunk of the book is dedicated to the issue of Afghanistan. You obviously worked on the country for decades and spearheaded a very influential report that sought to bring to light some of the issues and also failures of US development assistance to bring about meaningful change in the country. Now, obviously, Afghanistan's been in the news in recent months, and not always for good reasons. With the Taliban takeover of the country, direct US engagement is much more limited, especially beyond humanitarian assistance. And the scope for international actors to further advance development objectives is definitely uncertain. So I was wondering if you could cast your mind back to that report you wrote and maybe talk a little bit about what you see as the key US failings to promote development, or at least build a stronger state in Afghanistan. And what lessons can we apply to other settings? Obviously, we've got a crisis in Ukraine happening now. There are crises happening around the world. What sort of lessons should we really be drawing from the Afghanistan experience?
Yeah, no, thanks, Helen. You know, when I started writing, I didn't actually think most of the book would end up being about Afghanistan, but somehow there's a lot of it in there. And there's a lot of stories that connect together from my time in Capitol Hill to my time in the executive branch at the State Department, working on both issues, looking at it bilaterally, but also regional connectivity. And just to step back for a moment, there's been a lot of attention on Afghanistan after what happened in the summer of 2021. But many of us may not remember how we got here. And I think the how we got here story is incredibly important. Oftentimes during crises, we respond to the information at hand in what's breaking news of the moment. And I think taking a giant step back in many cases to understand the historical context, to understand the political context which we've inherited in any situation can give us a lot of lessons learned. So just to remind our viewers, Afghanistan became the top US foreign policy priority after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And for many of us who lived and worked during that time, were very impacted by the events of 9/11. And our foreign policy priorities in Washington were greatly influenced by that. By 2011, the US had invested more on foreign aid in Afghanistan than in any other country combined. That's the scale of how much aid we are talking about. It's a mind-boggling on the foreign aid side, $320 million a month we were pumping into Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan at that time was one of the poorest countries in the world. And so on the one hand, we can really cheer on that we are putting money where you have extreme poverty, and you're doing it at tremendous scale. On the other hand, it often takes foreign policy crises for policymakers to have that kind of attention, to want to put that type of foreign aid in. Outside of that foreign policy, national security crisis, it's often very hard, as all of us know in the work we do, to get that kind of attention. So Afghanistan had that political attention, that political scrutiny, and it had the budgets to go with it. But then what happened? And, you know, I spent 5 years on Capitol Hill with oversight when my time in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the broader region. And I had oversight of an account that was over $6 billion of US taxpayer assistance of foreign aid spent in the region. I think I read almost every single report, both formal and informal, that was documented during that time period. Multiple, probably dozens and hundreds of briefings with administration officials, multiple trips to the region to see firsthand, conversations with civil society, NGOs, contractors to understand how the money was actually being spent. And despite what I was often told in formal briefings by both military and civilian officials in Washington, in Kabul, and elsewhere, it was clear to me even back then we were not winning the war, and that what we were putting together was not sustainable, and that we were artificially, inflating the economic and political situation in the country. So I decided to take a stab back then, and I was a young congressional staffer, to put this into context, but I decided to take all the tools that I had at my disposal as a congressional staffer, which was quite a lot actually, and pull all the information together into this report that was released in June 2011 by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that basically argued that our aid and our footprint in Afghanistan should be necessary, achievable, and sustainable. In many cases, what we had in Afghanistan was a situation that was dominated by a military strategy that also affected how we spent foreign aid. Helen, you may remember, during the height of 2000s, the biggest buzzword, I think, in Washington back in the day was COIN, counterinsurgency strategy in theory. And it really dominated not just military thinking, but it really dominated the foreign aid footprint and where geographically we would put money into the country and how we would spend it. including in the South, in poppy fields where poppy farmers were, to incentivize them to move away. So unlike conventional warfare, COIN really required a comprehensive civilian solution at scale. So we did pour in a lot of money, but in Afghanistan, we inherited a situation back in 2001 that meant constructing a functioning nation from scratch, and was largely financed by the American taxpayer. This nation building strategy and assumption, it required wholesale creation of Afghan police and security forces, government ministries, courts and legal systems, roads, schools, and farms. And all those institutions needed to be created by the international community overnight. I think we did a lot of good in Afghanistan, and I want to give credit to so many people all around the world, many, many countries, and to the Afghans themselves who showed enormous courage and bravery to get the job done where they could. But fundamentally, Helen, one of the things that the report really highlighted is that when you have a system of aid at that scale, and I mean, if you go back, the appropriations bill, if I'm remembering correctly, in fiscal 2009 for Afghanistan was a staggering $4.1 billion a year for the foreign aid line alone for Afghanistan. And when you have a strategy that is that big at scale, and you see that happening in places, again, like Iraq, Syria, we'll see what happens in Ukraine, there is enormous pressure in the way our political systems work to spend that money in an annual appropriations cycle. The reality is, and we all know this as development experts, there's no way to spend all of that money well within a year. You end up being forced to spend large chunks of money in large contracts just to get the money off your books and out the door, instead of taking that money and investing in a 5, 10, 20-year strategy that over time can disperse those funds. Many times our political strategies, both in Washington, but also other multilateral institutions and other aid agencies as well, are not actually set up for multi-year appropriation cycles that can help us responsibly cycle and invest the money in sustainable ways, not just in foreign capitals like in Kabul, but at the local level as well. And so I'll just end. There's so much I could say about Afghanistan. I think I devoted half the book to it at the end of the day, so there's a lot in there for those interested, and especially a lot of behind the scenes stories of the grind, really, for those of us that worked in it, the safety issues we faced, the fatigue and the exhaustion. But I would summarize, there's 21 recommendations in the book. Many of them apply to your question. And I would say on money, which is one of the 6 top sectoral recommendations, you know, as you think about development diplomacy and the role development diplomats can play, how much money is spent is just as important. How money is spent is just as important as how much money is spent. And I think sometimes we focus too much on the total amounts and not the how, and not the mechanisms, and understanding not just the contract, but the subcontract, the subcontract, and every layer down below. The second thing I'll just say really quickly is that there's a range of long-term development financing options, and it's not just USAID funding, it's the World Bank's trust funds, DFID funding, many other pots of funding. And when you take it all together, it can be very hard, even for those of us where this is a full-time job, to understand the entire totality of aid. It can be mind-boggling to actually understand how the aid actually complements each other. And I think there's something about aid complementarity in the system we need to really wrap our heads around and figure out how we do better, not just so it shows up in budget charts, but actually on the ground, there's the impact that was intended. And lastly, the thing I'll say on Afghanistan that for me was frustrating is that our plans often, not just from Washington, but our friends all around the world, whether that was from Brussels or London or many other places, most of our planning was in very short-term cycles for the development aid. And that made it almost impossible to think about a long-term sustainable and inclusive economic growth strategy, particularly in areas that were not the prime areas for a counterinsurgency strategy. So while there was a lot of attention in the south and the east of Afghanistan because of the large prevalence of terrorist activity and military activity in those areas, poor populations in the north and the west, for instance, were largely shortchanged. And it became very hard to have a national strategy to go where the need was felt the most. And so those are some of the things I wrote about in this June 2011 report that came out. And I want to give tremendous recognition to the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time, then Senator Kerry, who really championed a different way to think about aid in Afghanistan to meet our foreign policy and national security objectives.
No, thank you very much. A lot of that depressingly resonates with many of the things we've been writing about especially USAID and now the SCBO, about how they disperse aid and how they think about multi-year grants as sort of building a more of a cohesive, coherent strategy. It also flows in very nicely to my second question, that piece about multi-year grants. So the final chapters of your book touch on your time at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, so an agency to which you're at now as well. And for those of you who don't know, MCC provides large-scale, multi-year grants to select low and low middle-income countries who demonstrate relatively strong political and economic governance. So these grants, which are known as compacts, all include conditions which are normally linked to policy reform, things that the country government agrees to pursue as part of the compact agreement. But you and me both, and most of the people on the call will know that conditionality in aid has a very long and sometimes fraught history. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk to me a little bit about what you think the role of conditions are on aid, and under what circumstances do you think they're more or less likely to be effective?
Yeah. So actually, so much of my book ends up becoming in some way around this issue around leverage. And I think the word I talk a lot about is leverage. And what leverage do we have to really enact the kinds of policy institutional reforms that we know have to accompany the type of systemic change that we are all seeking to do. So we know, Helen, right, we all know, for those of us that work in international development, we can build schools, bridges, roads, substations. That in and of itself is not going to be enough to really make sure that the dividends of the investment reach those most in need and are sustainable and integrated at the local and national levels in ways that really kind of yield the kind of gains we're trying to invest in. And so you have to take a comprehensive approach. Now, depending on on the point of where you're coming from and where you're starting, when I worked in civil society, for instance, the scale of what we were doing was a much smaller scale than what I'm able to do or what we're able to do collectively in the US government, for instance, whether we work at USAID or MCC, or if you work at the bank or the UN or other large scale institutions where you have the money at scale. So scale can matter. And the way scale can matter is it can create opportunities for leverage of the money. All of a sudden can become really important to a line finance minister, for instance, a very key component of how they're doing their economic planning, their long-term 5-year planning. When the money can be used smartly, responsibly, and sustainably to tie to key investments where you have buy-in, where you really need the political buy-in. And so it's not just imposed from the outside, but where there's a shared conversation and a shared sense of responsibility that this is in the country's interest, and this is what they want to do and are committed to do. And they are the ones creating the roadmap and using the tools you are offering as their own incentive to get it done. So, Helen, I've worked in so many countries with different governments of all political parties and stripes who often want the same things we do and know better, of course, than what we do on the steps that their own countries need to take to reach the types of economic growth they want to unlock. But it can be hard even in their own political systems to unlock the different pieces to get it done. So one of the things that I've seen that has worked very well with MCC's model and our compacts is it provides oftentimes our partners tools to get the job done and to do the things that they've been trying to do for a very long time, and oftentimes with frustrating outcomes and results. So I think conditionality is fraught with a lot of opinions around is it good or bad, as if it's a binary choice. And what I would say is the way you can use leverage is, and conditionality around policy and institutional reforms in particular, is when it is done in a shared way where the roadmap is driven not by a donor or by a foreign capital, because this is what we want to see, but when it's done in shared partnership with the partner country, because they know this is what they need and want, and they're working with us to figure out how to get it done. Now, it doesn't always work. It can be very politically fraught and complicated. you can spend years negotiating with one government, with one set of actors, and then a national election or local elections come, and all of a sudden, all of your partners on the other side change, and the incoming party does not share that agenda, or you feel like you're starting all over again. So, part of the challenge and the opportunity with international development and aid is when done right, you take a long-term view. It can be hard because you're working in short-term political cycles, not just here in Washington, but with partner countries overseas. And so one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is I share a lot of stories from countries I've worked in. I've traveled to over many countries, and I share stories from about 30 plus country snapshots around some of these examples where oftentimes on the development side, we're not trained to understand politics. We're not trained to understand political cycles, to understand political economy enough to really get the job done, because we're trained on how to design the program, how to implement the program, how to monitor and then evaluate the success of the design. But what I've seen in my career, because I've crossed both the foreign policy and international development spaces, and the whole point of, and my theory around development diplomacy here is when you can leverage, when you leverage the diplomatic efforts as well to help better understand and navigate those political spaces, we have a better chance of getting it done. And I think there's so much work here on the development side to train the next generation of development diplomats to think differently about some of those spaces. In the same way, on the foreign policy side, there's a huge opportunity to train our foreign policy officials growing up through the next generation around the development side and how they can better understand, speak, and translate our priorities as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you're one of those budding development or diplomacy career professionals, I'd again very much recommend you get the book, because there's a lot of very practical advice about which courses you should take and who you should speak to, and provides a very nice 101 on all of the acronyms on Capitol Hill, which I also found incredibly useful. But yeah, as you say, one of the central theses, or the central thesis of the book, is that development and diplomacy needs to come closer together. And I think there has been increasing recognition that these two spheres, as well as security, are just too far apart right now, and they're often unaligned in what they're trying to achieve. And we know that there's been a number of efforts over the last few years to try and bring these pillars closer together. So we've seen new frameworks and laws and administrative actions, and they're trying to better articulate what the different roles and responsibilities are of different agencies and try and encourage better coordination between them. I mean, based on your experience, do you think these are working? I mean, do you think they're going far enough? And what do you think are the major barriers to really actually improving this coordination in practice?
Well, I'm going to share some personal story
Please.
First to put this in context, because, and I don't know if this resonates with you, Helen, or other viewers, but for many of us, if you go back to your 16-year-old self, or 18 or 21, or pick your age, I don't know, maybe you were 9, I don't know. But many of us had a moment somewhere early in our lives, maybe because we grew up with poverty, maybe because we knew others, maybe because we were in Peace Corps, maybe we had that really transformative experience in college when we studied abroad. Pick your moment, where you decided that you wanted to contribute to a better world and have impact and end poverty at scale. And or make the world a better place. As corny as that sounds, it could be as simple as that, which it was for me actually as a teenager. And going back to my teenage self, and I write about these experiences that shaped me in the book of being in Girl Scouts, growing up with a single mom, a lot of the things that I struggled and experienced as a teenager. All I knew when I wanted to go into college is that I wanted to help make the world a better place. Somehow I wanted to help, but I didn't know what that meant in any real way. And frankly, I could have gone in lots of different directions. I ended up in undergrad studying international relations, in graduate school. I stayed also in international public policy side. And Helen, I graduated with 2 very fancy Ivy League degrees from terrific institutions. And I never, in that entire my academic training, I never took an international development class, if you can imagine. And the reason is because I just didn't have to. I didn't have to. And so before you even talk about careers, before you even talk about changes at the institutional level, whether it's in the US government or World Bank or UN or any other institutions, you know, a lot of times the siloing starts back in college, back in graduate school, back in the actual academic training, because the worlds are academically very far apart. And there's not a huge overlap actually in the academic spaces between foreign policy and international development. You train differently, you read differently, your curriculum is completely different. And so by the time you're even getting your first internship, you've already picked a path and you're 21. And you have no clue that that's the path that's now going to shape you for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And as you grow up in your career, there's very few incentives to take sabbaticals, to go join other agencies or look at it from a different perspective. You're not promoted for that. There's very few crossover opportunities, etc. I was very lucky because I was a presidential management fellow of PMF. And so I got to dabble wherever I wanted to dabble. And through that dabbling is where I saw the intersectionality of those worlds. So I'm sharing that, Helen, because in the book, I actually put together a suggested curriculum, and we can share it with our, we'll share it around. I'll send it to you. But it's in the book, and I have snapshots of it. But it basically looks at, if you go all the way back to academic training grounds, how could we train differently from the very get-go to bridge some of the gaps and actually train in the development diplomacy spaces from the get-go? Because we're not trained to do it. Then when you get to your actual career and your jobs, your internships, your first job, and as you move up the chain of command, we're not trained even on the job training to really know very much about the other. We really do work in our silos in many ways. And that's not our fault, actually. It's actually how the systems are, it's the incentives of the system, of the current system. And I don't think that's just in the US government, to be fair. I think that's something we see throughout the spaces that are replicated over and over and over. So I would love to see, Helen, in my ideal state, I would love to see initiatives that really actively train, create, train, and invest in the next generation of development diplomats. And these are people that can work, it doesn't have to be from a US context, these are people that can work to really leverage diplomatic efforts for international development. And you know, you could be a Hill staffer, you could be a government official, you could be in the multilateral space, you could be a mayor, you could be a donor. I've done so many talks with major philanthropic donors who could be amazing voices if they were also trained on the political side to understand how to leverage their dollars, their money, their voice, and connected across the way. This certainly works for civil societies and NGOs in the world I was in before I returned back to US government. So I think it's almost taking a big giant step back and rethinking what we are training for versus just coordination, collaboration, and across different agencies and ways of working, because you're almost training and building a new muscle and a new skill set. So think about how many ambassadors, as an example, and I give a lot of examples of stories with ambassadors in the book from different countries. But think about how many ambassadors, most of them grow up professionally in the political tracks, right, of the foreign service. How many of them really bring strong international development knowledge or background to the table because of their academic training, right? And yet they are the face that will help broker and deliver much of what governments deliver at scale at the end of the day. And you know, beyond one or two basic courses that they may have to take in their training back in the day, it's a lot of on-the-job training. And I've worked with terrific ambassadors who just knock it out of the park, you know, but we can be very intentional about making sure that this is part of their agenda and training throughout the 20, 30 years before they even become ambassadors, right? And so it's really taking a long-term view of how we can rebuild, rethink, retrain a really different type of person that can talk across these fields and break down these silos, which, Helen, as you and I know, are completely artificial, and yet are systematically organized around, we're all organized around them in very concrete ways.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of that personally resonates with me. And I think, CGD is trying to do quite a lot at the moment to try and build this kind of cohort of people, but I'm sure there's much more that all of us can do. And hopefully we can return to that later in the discussion. So the last question from me before I open it up to the audience, so please do submit your questions and we'll start filtering them through, is just changing tack a little bit. So the book, as you're mentioning, is full of examples where you talk through some of the struggles and experiences that you have of being, especially at the beginning, a young South Asian woman and eventually a mother of three in a world that, at then and probably still now is dominated by older white men predominantly. And one of my personal favorite anecdotes in the book is you breastfeeding the child in the back of the car at a parking lot in breaks between meetings, because it didn't really occur to you that you could ask for a room to do so where you were having your meetings. I just thought it was a really fascinating illustrative example of how we may not even think to ask the kind of the enabling environment that we actually need. So I was wondering whether maybe you could talk a little bit about how you think both of these development and foreign policy realms need to adapt to become more inclusive and supportive of a more diverse group of people.
Well, for most of my career growing up, so, when I was a newbie in my 20s, and then as I was maturing into my 30s professionally, I had zero incentive to ever talk about being a mom or a woman, right? I mean, I was always trying to keep up with my cohorts, which were all men, particularly on the Hill, when I worked in the Senate. You did not bring your full self to work. There was no incentive to do that. I did not talk about what it took to rejuggle the schedule, because the senator's schedule would change a million times. And that meant I had to restructure drop-off, daycare, nannies, figure out doctor's appointments, figure out how to run to the grocery store so that I could then mash up the vegetables to make their puree for dinner. Figuring out how to pump all the time secretly between meetings, even in Capitol Hill or in Washington, let alone in war zones in Afghanistan or other dangerous places that I traveled. It just, I had no role models really in this space. And those that were the women that had made it, we didn't have networks back then when I was growing up of mentorship or ways to really help me understand. And certainly amongst minority women, there were so few of them in the worlds I occupied that, I can't remember a single woman early in my career where I could have kind of easily talked to or connected with or felt safe or comfortable with. And, I was young, I was naive, I was politically not connected. I was, newbie to Washington. I did not have these great networks and everything else. And so it can feel very, very intimidating. I like many women out there, every time I got a job, I felt so grateful, so desperately grateful, I think is the term. I never thought to negotiate for more money, to ask for anything more, to put any of my true self out there, because I was not suicidal, and I was just so grateful to get the job in the first place. And I think that for me was very much of my experience growing up in the careers that I've had across these spaces. So I've been really gratified to see the societal changes that have taken place over the last few years in particular. And I think COVID has really created an opportunity during the pandemic for a different type of conversation of what it's going to take. And I hope we can, even as we normalize now, as we become in the endemic stage of the pandemic, I hope we don't go backwards. I hope we can really lean in and understand what it takes, the juggling, the intense multitasking and juggling it takes for so many of us to, at the end of the day, look like we're polished and put together and know what we're talking about. I mean, I wish sometimes I joke with my husband, I wish I could actually share by the time 9 o'clock has come and we're all dressed and ready to go for our jobs, what the last 4 hours of my life were actually like. And the intense battles and the fatigue. I mean, you're exhausted by 9 a.m. on most days, right? Let alone by the time 6, 7, 8 p.m. roll around. And I don't think we have really created a lot of spaces societally yet to have that conversation and to understand the immense burden caregivers in particular, whether your parents, moms, dad, maybe you're caring for elder relatives or others in your family, the burden that we're carrying, particularly here in the US, where we live in nuclear families, we can't afford the live-in nannies or day, providers that you can in other societies, is enormous. And I don't think we have fully had that conversation. You tend to look very weak in some cases when you bring that conversation in, like you can't handle it. I'm a senior woman and leader now in my career, and I still try to figure out the right balance of what I can bring forward and what I can model for my own staff. So I think I'm grateful to see the conversations around maternity and paternity leave. One of the stories I didn't share in the book because I didn't make a decision of what to cut, but one of the stories that I think I wish I had shared, but looking back, is when I was pregnant with my first daughter. We were young, we were broke, and I just joined the State Department. I had no leave saved up. There was no maternity leave back in the day, and so all you can do is go on unpaid leave for up to 12 weeks under FMLA and not get fired. And I was completely economically stressed out by the situation. But at the end of the day, I wanted to have my daughter, and it was what it was. I was one of the big moments of my young career was I kept getting paid somehow when I took this leave, and I couldn't figure out why. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should just keep the paychecks and be like I got it, I'm not going to ask questions. But then, what if 20 years later, the government asked me to pay it all back with interest or something, and that I could end up being broke from that. So I called in payroll at the State Department and I said, look, there's a big mistake. I'm supposed to be on unpaid leave, but I'm getting paid. And they looked into it, and Helen, they called me back and they said, all your colleagues in my bureau at the State Department put their leave together to cover mine for the 12 weeks because they understood my situation. And I've always really, I have to say, that one gesture of extreme generosity and kindness, I never forget that. And I say that because that shouldn't be what it needs to take to get it done. And that's how extreme sometimes it can be for those of us that are struggling just to make it. So I think we have a lot of work to do, not just structurally and institutionally, but culturally, to be able to have these conversations in ways that really value what it means to bring your full self to the table, and value then that you're not going to look so polished and put together when you start sharing what that actually looks like behind the scenes, and particularly for women, particularly for minorities, that's a really hard space to occupy when you already feel like you're at such a deficit of power to begin with. And so I think there's still a long road ahead, but I'm excited that we're finally having the conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a way, COVID's probably been quite good for that. I mean, I don't know what you felt, but definitely in my organization, people working from home, having their kids and pets interrupted them when they're speaking, having to be a little bit more honest about what their responsibilities are at home. Like, I can't work this afternoon because I need to parent or homeschool my children. I think it's created a slightly better environment where we're all a little bit more aware of what other people have going on at home, and a slightly more, hopefully, I think, accepting of that, and I'll allow people a little bit more space to kind of get back to you a few days later or address something a few days later. And I hope that carries on as sort of a post-COVID environment. So we've got one question through, which is just coming back to the point that you made about training. So the question asks, you talk about training the next generation of development diplomats in the fields of foreign policy and international development. What exact skills do you think they need to develop before entering that field?
I love that question. So I have two specific things in the book, and Helen, I'll share these handouts that maybe we can share with those attended, and we can share online as well. So in the book, I put together a curriculum for development diplomats. So this goes back to the training grounds, back in the day, college, grad school, and everything in between. So there's suggested courses in there, and they range from everything to the politics of domestic and international public policy, to psychology and negotiations for policy analysis, to understanding the role of either, if you're studying the US, the executive branch and the Hill, or if you're not studying the US, parliamentary systems, the role of civil society in public policy. I think that's something we actually shortchange a lot in our academic training. And then looking at political economy analysis and the fundamentals of development, particularly for those on both sides of the aisle. I also put together suggested competencies in the book that I think development diplomats need to have. So there's a whole range of them. I'm not going to read them all right now, but let me just highlight a couple of them. First is if in your academic training, if you come away with a really solid understanding of foreign policy, national security, development, and foreign assistance, you are 95% ahead of the most of the rest of us, right? Because most of us pick one of those lanes and then try to learn and lean into one of those lanes. It's very hard to see the intersectionality of all of that. Another area that I think is very shortchanged on competencies is around budgets and understanding money flows. Very few of us, we think, okay, well, we don't want to be accountants and we don't want to go into the accounting lane or the COO lanes. But actually understanding federal budgeting, understanding organizational budgeting, understanding how money flows, not just of how it's allocated, but how actually flows down to contractors, subcontractors, and the like, and how money gets out the door can be such a powerful tool to understand what policy is actually doing. Not the intent of policy, but the actual results on the ground when you follow the money. But very few of us are trained to follow the money. And then the third thing I'll just pull out and highlight is emotional skills. Often we're trained in technical competencies, whether you're studying development or foreign policy, maybe you're studying econometrics or statistics. We're trained very technically to understand data, to dissect and measure and understand the impact of the results we're seeing. But something for me, Helen, gets lost in all of that sometimes when we don't necessarily understand or bring people to the table. And what I mean by that is, what you're seeing today is this explosion, or whether it's social media, whether it's here in the United States or all around the world, of people's emotional reactions to major public policy decisions, right? And they're not always grounded in facts, truth, data, or logic, which is how we study. We make a lot of assumptions. I mean, for those of you that went to public policy school like I did, a lot of the trainings and the courses we take are around, here's the data, here's the evidence, here's the facts, here's the statistical modeling, and from that, you should make very logical conclusions of what those policy recommendations are. So the policy should be because the data says this. Actually, we're seeing failures of that approach all around the world right now, whether it's on health policy or anything else, because it's not how people feel about it or how they're processing the information or what they think it means to them, either threatening or otherwise. And I think there's a space here that we are missing. The last thing that's not in the book, because I will say I wrote this book and it got published over the summer, fall. But one of the experiences I've had since then, that if I wrote a different version of the book, I would talk about a lot more. If I could go back and do it all over again, and I'm going to do it anyway because I have to now in my own career, is we're not trained around media and social media and understanding how to communicate the work that we're doing, the messaging around it in different ways, in different languages, in different cultural norms and ways that connect. Even when the major social media platforms, I feel like there's 6 others that have popped up overnight in a different country or context that I'm like, what is that? And how do I navigate that? And you're always behind. And so the communications angle, I think, is also really important. And it's a space that many of us, we do the work, we spend years doing the work, and then we struggle with how to communicate our findings in ways that actually resonate with the very people we're trying to influence.
Yeah, all of that speaks very directly to me. I mean, most of my work at the moment is in migration policy, which I think is an area that maybe is furthest from what the evidence says, but is also one that's very near and dear to many people's hearts and one where many people have very strong opinions on. And I do think solving that communications battle around policy issues, especially ones that are very contentious, ones where everybody has an opinion, ones where we're trying to communicate facts and evidence that may run contrary to what people intrinsically believe, is even more important. We've got another question through, which is one of my favorite questions in international development, which is basically, should we be trying to put ourselves out of a job? So we're seeing, quite a big push at the moment to try and localize development. So, prioritize local context, hire local actors, hire people on the ground, capacity build people on the ground. But we're also, seeing a bit of pushback, I think, among especially big NGOs, big international organizations. They don't want to lose their power. They don't want to lose their funding. And I think there's a bit of a struggle there. We know that we should be localizing development in different ways, but there's always going to be a bit of a pushback from some of these entrenched power interests. So I was just wondering, how do we actually try and balance that? What do you think is sort of the end goal here? What should we be trying to work towards?
Well, the word that I'm going to pick up on that you said, Helen, that really resonates with me and something I think a lot about is power. The word power is something we need to deconstruct and understand what our goal really is. Is our goal in the system to just get more power, and power can be represented by rank, title, money, influence, and many other things. Is our goal to give away our power? Is it to shift the power? Is it to share the power? I don't think we have a shared understanding of what we're trying to do vis-a-vis power. And that's a problem, actually. So, and I think, even when I was in the NGO world, you could survey, 10 different people on any given day in your organization, and they have 10 different ideas and answers on the very same question of what's our actual goal here? Is it to power share? And so we're going to split the funding. Is it to devolve our power? So we're literally going to give it away, and I'm going to fire American staff and hire local staff. Is it giving up my speaking spot to some, what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish and why? And the thing with power is it's very hard to get and very hard to give up, right? At the end of the day, as a human construct. And so when you multiply that out institutionally to all your major powerful institutions of power, it's easy to give the speeches. I mean, you all can write speeches. It's very hard to actually do the work to deconstruct and agree on the goal and then to get it done. And so the question on giving up the job, or, are we trying to work ourselves out of a job? It's to what end? What is it? It depends what your end goal is in the system. And I think that's something where we don't always have the same understanding, or we may be on different pages around what that actually looks like. So, I remember I was in an African country during a big humanitarian disaster a few years ago, and the UN Secretary General had just come from a visit, and I remember NGOs that I was speaking to, Western NGOs, they were so proud to kind of show me around what was happening, the aid that we were collectively delivering. And they said the Secretary General was just here. We got to brief him. It was very exciting that we got to speak directly with him on what was happening. And so I said, well, that's great, congratulations, but I just quick question here. Since you had that spot and the UN gave you that spot, why didn't you give it to one of your local partners to brief the Secretary General instead? Why did we occupy that space when in fact our local partners on the ground are the ones doing all of the work? And we are flying in and flying out, right, as these things go. And they're like, well, it's our job to brief the Secretary. I mean, that's a hard power shift, right, and dynamic. And so it can be everything from the most simple steps that we can take to diversify who's at the table and who has voice, to the really, I think, much more complex around funding, money, jobs, staff, who's on boards, all of those kind of steps as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting conversations happening in this space, but we also need to push the envelope on where we're trying to end up.
Yeah, absolutely agree, especially about not necessarily having a shared understanding of what our end goal is here. And I think everybody has slightly different end goals. I think we're all trying in our own different ways, especially as you were saying, to kind of shift power in different ways. But whether it's exactly what people want and whether it's all moving in the right direction is definitely up for debate. So I think we definitely have time for one more question, maybe two. So we've got one here that just kind of harks back to what we were talking about before around sort of the distinction between public opinion and evidence-based policies. So this is probably even more important right now in the US, obviously increasing partisanship, a bit of a pushback against evidence and evidence-based policies. So, maybe especially in the aid realm, how do you balance, delivering aid in an evidence and data-based way while also sort of satisfying constituencies and public opinion and, what you feel like public support is for aid and what they actually want it to achieve?
Yeah. So in chapter 2 of the book, I talk about the construct of development assistance in the US and fact versus fiction. And so, most Americans, when they're polled, they think something like that we spend something like 25% of our budget on foreign aid, when all of us know it's such a paltry less than 1% amount. So the misperceptions that are out there are certainly real. I think building constituencies, both political constituencies in Washington, but across the country and wherever you are. I mean, I don't want to be just a US-centric conversation, but building political constituencies to understand at a fundamental level why it's in any taxpayer's best interest to give money to somebody else is a conversation we really need to have, those of us who do this work, we get it. We live it every single day. We know the benefit of why we do what we do. But it can be very hard to translate that for your neighbor down the street, right? For communities in need right in your own backyard, right? I live up here in Boston, Massachusetts during the pandemic, and I live in one of the wealthiest cities in the world, hands down. Massachusetts had the highest rates of hunger in the country during the pandemic, right? Because of the rise, the great rise in inequality that we're seeing exploding around the United States and certainly all around the world. One of the things that is shifting that I think we can lean into more, Helen, poverty is not, there's this perception of poverty, especially here in the US, at least is my personal observation, that poverty is often seen as a Black and brown person problem, right? That's where poverty is about Black and brown people, both here in the US, but certainly overseas. And you think about poverty, you think about Black and brown countries being poor. In fact, we're seeing some of the highest rates of inequality that the world has ever seen. It's something like, according to Oxfam, 22 of the richest men in the world, 22 of the richest men in the world have more wealth than all of the women in Africa, right? That's the world we all live in right now. We have the highest rates of inequality the world has ever seen to date. So poverty is not a third world country, developing country problem. It is something that we all face even in the richest cities in the world, and in the richest countries in the world. And we all see that. And I think actually COVID has brought that home for many of us in ways that may have felt more further away before. So just to kind of come back and say that I think there's an opportunity that the pandemic has given us to reshift and reframe a conversation about how interconnected we are and how these borders that are geographic borders, but maybe other types of borders, are incredibly artificial in some ways and fragile, and don't give us the protections we think they should accrue to us over time in this increasingly digital world we live in this world where viruses can cross borders without passports. It does matter what happens next door to what happens to your own house. It does matter. We can tell a better story, not just for foreign aid, but this idea, and again, this is a silo even between domestic aid and foreign aid, right? But that money can be used in service of public policy to help communities in need, whether they're here at home and or overseas. We can tell a better story. We have to tell a better story, I think, if we're going to get the budgets that we need at scale to do the work that we want to do. And so I think we need to rethink, again, coming back to our comms and our communications messaging, how to get some of these messages across.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been some really amazing work I know done here in the UK about trying to communicate what aid is and what it does better, and also trying to relate it better to people's lived experiences within the country that the aid is coming from, and showing them why it's important, why we need to be supporting people abroad, and why it's in their best interest to do so as well. And so I think, as you say, there's quite a big communications role there, quite a big communications campaign that needs to happen to be able to sort of talk about what we're doing and why it's important. So I've got one more question, and then I think we'll probably need to wrap up. So it's come through around how diplomats are trained. So coming back to some of the pieces you were mentioning before, do you think there is a change coming here around how diplomats are trained, especially to take account things like economics and local politics and some budget dynamics? So you mentioned that they need to. Do you think it's actually happening on the ground?
I hope so. I hope it's happening. I don't know firsthand right now. It's not in my lane right now or my line of sight, but I hope it's happening. I know there's been some terrific conversations underway. I think people see the need, they understand the gaps. Clearly we have a massive, here in Washington, for instance, where you have one of the largest cohorts of retirees coming in the federal workforce that we've seen in some time. We're going to need to rebuild the civilian workforce here in the US government. There's huge opportunities during crises to think differently, to rebuild differently, to turn that Rubik's Cube and look at it from a different angle. So I hope that we can take a different look. I hope we can think about not breaking some of these artificial silos that we've not just created and inherited, but that we now actually represent, each of us in our own ways, because it's what we know and it's the worlds we inherit. I would love to see training focus on development diplomacy and actually creating a generation of development diplomats that can work across capitals in different ways. Think about your 20-year-old self, if you were retrained differently to think across these worlds, how different the opportunities you'd have to convey the work you do to different audiences in ways that could help have bigger impact. I'll just end with this, Helen. Because of the PMF, the Presidential Management Fellow experience that I had, I ended up on Capitol Hill. And when you're working for politicians, sometimes you just get down to brass tacks, because ultimately you just have to sell what you're doing back to your home constituencies. And I was never trained for any of that in my very polished, academic training of foreign policy and international relations. And I learned so much when you work in the political systems, you learn so much about not just messaging and communications, but around the intersectionality of the work. I do a lot of career mentoring, and I always say, go to the Hill. If you have an opportunity, go to the Hill and see it from a different lens. And if you're not in Washington, go to your parliament and go see it from a different lens. I hope we can train across these silos, not just on the executive side or the legislative side, not just in government, but across the board. And I hope we train up a next generation of development diplomats that are actually actively trained to think and act differently and really model a different way of thinking. It's an exciting space. It's a really hard space, but I think a lot of us crave, we want to rise to those challenges. And that's why we signed up for this line of work to begin with. And we want to have impact at scale. And we know we can, if we can get others around us also to think differently, in addition to ourselves. So I'm excited. I think there are a lot of opportunities here to think differently. With crisis comes a lot of opportunities. I hope we seize those opportunities.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, your book is definitely going a long way to trying to achieve that. So with the last couple of minutes, I just want to thank everybody for being here with us today. Thank you for the excellent questions, and especially thank you to Fatema for generously giving her time to talk through her new book, which I will flash back up here again, The Development Diplomat, Working Across Borders, Boardrooms, and Bureaucracies to End Poverty. Again, I mean, if you've enjoyed this discussion today, and if you want to delve into more, there is so much more in the book. I think the anecdotes in particular are really fascinating, funny, interesting. Definitely encourage you to head out and buy a copy. And I very much look forward to seeing you at the next CGD event. So I hope you have a really lovely rest of your day, and see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thanks to CGD. I really appreciate it.